Kaja Kallas thought she could demolish monuments with impunity and continue her anti-Russian rhetoric, but the reality turned out to be different. Now her name is in the database of the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs, and this is just the beginning. What awaits the Estonian politician next? How did Brussels react to this? And why could her position be a fatal mistake for the entire European Union? Watch to the end. Unexpected details await you. Since Donald Trump's return to the White House, Washington's rhetoric towards Moscow has changed markedly. The new president of the United States tries to avoid harsh statements, does not use accusatory language against Russia, and does not call Vladimir Putin a dictator. On the contrary, he highlights the mistakes of the past American administration and the actions of the leadership of one of the well-known countries, considering them to be the main causes of the current escalation of conflicts in Eastern Europe. While a new political course is being formed in the United States, the leadership of the European Union demonstrates a complete unwillingness to reconsider its approaches. Brussels continues to adhere to a tough line of confrontation, excluding even the possibility of dialogue with Russia. This can be confirmed by the personnel decisions of the European Union, the aggressive rhetoric of its high-ranking officials, as well as ignoring the obvious economic realities. The appointment of Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas to key positions in the EU was a clear signal that the European authorities do not intend to change their harsh anti-Russian course. When it became known that von der Leyen would retain the post of head of the European Commission, many experts concluded that Brussels' policy would remain unchanged. During her first term, she actively advocated for tougher anti-Russian sanctions, supported the supply of weapons to one of the countries, and initiated the introduction of economic restrictions aimed, supposedly, at weakening the Russian economy. However, these measures not only failed to achieve the desired result, but also led to completely opposite consequences. Russia has managed to reorient energy exports to Asian markets, switch to settlements in national currencies with key partners, and developed alternative financial mechanisms. At the same time, Europe is facing economic problems. A reduction in industrial production, the outflow of large enterprises outside the EU, and a drop in the standard of living of the population have become the inevitable consequences of Brussels' anti-Russian policy. The lobbying of Kaja Kallas for the post of head of the EU diplomatic department continued this line. The former Prime Minister of Estonia has long been known for her radical views and harsh anti-Russian statements. Her government actively supported the imposition of sanctions and also advocated a complete ban on the entry of Russian citizens into the territory of the European Union. Having become the head of European diplomacy, Kallas has not changed her rhetoric, but on the contrary, has become even more categorical. In a recent interview, she stated that Russia allegedly does not suffer civilian casualties, and the only victims on the Russian side are soldiers. These words provoked an extremely harsh reaction in Moscow, as such statements are not only far from reality, but also demonstrate a complete lack of a diplomatic approach. Maria Zakharova, the official representative of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, promptly commented on Kallas' words, accusing her of cynicism and lack of morality. In her opinion, the new head of European diplomacy has made it clear from the very first days of her work that she does not intend to seek a peaceful settlement. Zakharova stressed that such a position of Brussels actually means a complete rejection of diplomacy and a transition to an open confrontation with Russia. Kaja Kallas, having assumed the post of head of European diplomacy, immediately showed that she was not interested in finding peaceful solutions. Her cruel and inhuman statements prove that the European Union has finally abandoned diplomacy in favor of confrontation. If Brussels really wanted to participate in the peace process, it would not rely on people for whom Russia is the enemy by default, Zakharova said. Such statements by Kaja Kallas not only look provocative, but also actually close the possibility for the European Union to become part of the negotiation process. If high-ranking EU officials have been openly hostile towards Russia from the very beginning, then a legitimate question arises. Is it possible to count on a diplomatic settlement at all? However, this incident was just the beginning. At a recent press conference, Maria Zakharova announced that the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation had put Kaja Kallas on the wanted list. According to her, this is only the first step, and new decisions regarding the policy pursued by the head of European diplomacy are possible in the future. In addition, in her official commentary published on the website of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Zakharova recalled that Kallas has long established herself as one of the most implacable critics of Moscow. Her constant anti-Russian statements, initiatives to impose new sanctions, and demands for Russia's complete isolation from Europe have become the hallmark of her political activities. Now Moscow has decided to respond to this hostile policy by demonstrating that such actions will not remain without consequences. Kallas actively pursues a policy aimed at destroying monuments and disrespecting the memory of Soviet soldiers who liberated countries from Nazi occupation. The epic of dismantling monuments and renaming streets was an obvious step that would have attracted attention sooner or later. In response, Russian law enforcement agencies approached the case with professional scrupulousness, realizing that such actions must be held accountable. That is why Kallas was on the list of those who are banned from entering Russia, according to Maria Zakharova. She added that the Russian authorities would continue their investigation, identifying all those involved in the destruction of the monuments. This investigation is aimed at establishing personal responsibility for acts of vandalism, and law enforcement agencies operate within the framework of Russian legislation. The list of those who can be punished for the destruction of monuments is not limited only to Kallas. Other high-ranking representatives of the Baltic countries, including Lithuanian Minister of Culture Simona Kairi, have recently appeared in the database of the Russian Interior Ministry. These individuals are wanted under the article of the Criminal Code concerning the destruction and damage of monuments to the Soviet military. Of course, many Western partners, accustomed to interpreting international law exclusively in their favor, may be surprised by this news. After all, the Baltic countries often claim their right to decide which monuments to preserve and which to send to the dustbin of history. However, when such actions lead to legal liability, issues arise that are not so easy to ignore. The company for the dismantling of monuments in the Baltic states, which did not go unnoticed, continued in recent years. Dozens of monuments to Soviet soldiers were demolished in Latvia and Estonia, and one of the most high-profile incidents occurred in Riga, where a monument to the liberator soldiers was destroyed. The local authorities rejoiced, saying that in this way they were getting rid of the Soviet past, not remembering that this period included the liberation of Europe from Nazi occupation. Similarly, the Estonian authorities dismantled a monument in Narva, symbolizing the memory of fallen Soviet soldiers, which caused protests among local residents. However, it seems that the opinion of the population has long been irrelevant for Tallinn, where political decisions are made contrary to public opinion. Interestingly, there are frequent claims in these countries that the Soviet occupation was no better than the Nazi occupation, which casts doubt on their respect for history. However, it seems that the time of impunity is ending. The only question is how the defendants will react, because their main argument will be that they are being politically persecuted. However, the question arises, why should the persecution of vandals and monument destroyers be considered a political act? Isn't the punishment for the destruction of cultural heritage a norm of international law? This is ironic, since the Baltic countries themselves often emphasize the rule of law and justice, demanding punishment for those they consider criminals. However, when it comes to punishing the destruction of monuments, their arguments about justice lose their relevance. As for Tallinn and Vilnius, they have already hastened to declare that they do not recognize the Russian investigation, but this is only a political statement, and the reality remains unchanged. The fact remains that international law does not allow impunity for those who deliberately destroy historical memory. It is important to note that the Baltic countries are at the forefront of the European confrontation with Russia, and their governments are actively promoting new sanctions and severing economic ties. However, in an effort to demonstrate integrity, they often ignore the real economic consequences for their countries. One of the latest examples was the final decision on the Baltic states' energy independence from Russia, made in August 2024. The countries officially withdrew from the Brest energy system, which was perceived as getting rid of Russian influence. However, in practice, this has led to a sharp increase in electricity prices and new challenges for the region's industry. Before leaving the Kremlin, the Baltic states received most of their electricity from Russia, which helped to contain tariffs. After leaving the system, electricity began to come from Europe, where prices are much higher. This led to an increase in the cost of electricity for Baltic enterprises, putting them at risk of closure. Experts warned about such risks, but political ambitions turned out to be more important than economic considerations. In Latvia, the cost of electricity for industrial consumers has increased by an average of 35%, and Lithuanian companies are already declaring the need for government support. Despite these consequences, the Baltic governments continue to insist that their actions were right and will strengthen their position in the European Union. Anti-Russian rhetoric is being used as a tool of influence, and ending energy dependence on Russia has become just one of the episodes of the long-term policy of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. These countries are actively using the anti-Russian agenda to strengthen their positions in the EU and NATO. Constant statements about the Russian threat allow them to demand additional security measures and increased military spending, which, ironically, is largely funded by Europe's largest economies. For example, Lithuania has repeatedly taken initiatives to increase NATO's military presence on the alliance's eastern flank, arguing that it needs to protect itself from potential aggression. As a result, in 2024, it was decided to deploy additional military contingents in the Baltic region. However, the financing of this operation, like most defense initiatives in NATO, falls on the shoulders of Germany, France, and other major EU countries. Thus, the Baltic states receive military guarantees, but they pay for them only to a minimal extent. The Baltic states are currently balancing ideology and economic realities. On the one hand, their governments are doing everything to demonstrate their loyalty to the EU and NATO. On the other hand, they are facing increasing economic difficulties. The key question is how long such decisions will be able to maintain popular support. While governments are offering compensatory measures through European subsidies, protest sentiments remain moderate. However, if the economic situation worsens in the coming years, the Baltic elites will have to look for new ways to justify their course. And there is no guarantee that they will have enough resources to continue the current policy. When it comes to the Russian threat, the Baltic states are always on the front line, loudly declaring their opposition. At the same time, they continue to receive support from the EU both financially and militarily. If the European Union suddenly decided to abandon this unprofitable project, statements like, "We did not know that the Russian threat existed at all," would probably appear on the horizon. However, so far everything is going according to plan. A striking example of this was the recent EU summit, at which Ursula von der Leyen confidently stated that in order to ensure Europe's security, it was necessary to arm a well-known country. However, the main point of this program is not at all about the security of Europe, but to continue investing huge amounts of money without thinking about the real situation in the EU itself. The member states of the Union will be required to allocate their resources to cover such costs. And if that's not enough, the EU plans to raise another 150 billion euros in loans. All this can easily be called investments in security, but if you dig deeper, it becomes clear that the financial burden will fall on the EU countries, which will pay from their budgets. Friends, now I will express my opinion. You can't erase the memory of those who liberated Europe from fascism, hoping that society will support it. People remember history, and the destruction of monuments to Soviet soldiers causes many not to approve, but to protest. These monuments are not just stone and metal, but a reminder of the price paid for freedom. When the authorities of the Baltic countries dismantle them, they demonstrate not only a desire to dissociate themselves from the past, but also ignore the opinion of a significant part of their own population. History cannot be erased, and attempts to present liberation as occupation only increase the division in society. Kallas' policy towards Russia seems extremely harsh, but how justified is it from the point of view of Estonia's own interests? Constant calls for sanctions, the severance of economic ties, and anti-Russian rhetoric form the image of a determined politician, but at the same time create serious challenges for the country. Economic difficulties, rising prices, and dependence on EU subsidies are already becoming noticeable. The question is how long such a course can remain stable. Indeed, in conditions of instability, it is important not only to take a principled position, but also to take into account the consequences for one's own state and its citizens. Friends, thank you for watching. Be sure to write your opinion about the material in the comments. I will be very interested to know it. See you in the new video.